Hello, everyone. I'm Christina Henderson, Executive Director of the Montana High Tech Business Alliance. Welcome to our webinar, Know Your Neighbors, Understanding Montana's Indigenous People with Misty Kuhl. This event is part of a series the Alliance is hosting with resources to help our communities deal with the impacts of current events. You can find details of these sessions at mthightek.org/events. Our presenter today, Misty Kuhl, is a member of the Fort Belknap Indian Community and currently serves as Director of Native American Outreach at Rocky Mountain College in Billings. After Misty's presentation, we will open the floor for Q&A with the audience. We would ask the audience to mute your microphones until you have something to say. And if you have a question or comment to share during the meeting, you can either type it in the chat box or turn on your microphone to speak. Today's presentation will be recorded and shared afterwards. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Misty to get us started.
Nod your head. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today. Like Christina said, I am an Aaniiih member of Fort Belknap Community. I was born and raised on the High Line, and I'm just really excited to share what knowledge I have about Montana's Indigenous people. I will say we are extremely unique, and this is a field of study in higher education. So we have a lot to get through, and I will do my very, very best. I know that there will be time at the end of my presentation for questions. So there's a lot of content that I'm just going to sort of breeze through. We've got a couple of videos, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. The other thing I'll say is this is my second Zoom presentation, so I'm just asking for your forgiveness in advance as I'm still figuring things out, but here we go. Okay, can you see the screen okay? Yeah, okay, great. This is called Know Your Neighbors, Understanding Montana's Indigenous People. I am the Director of Native American Outreach at Rocky Mountain College, and it's a job that I love. I do have probably over 20 years of experience working with tribes all over the United States, from the bottom of Florida to the top of Alaska. But obviously my passion is tribal communities in Montana. So we're gonna dive in. What's in a name, right? I often get asked, is it Indian? Is it Native American, Indigenous, American Indian? I wish I had a perfect answer. My best answer is it's really up to the individual. Personally, I don't have a preference. But some do. And so in my opinion, when you're speaking personally with a Native, it might be important to just ask, how would you like to be referred as? So yeah, I think that's probably the best answer I could give to a kind of a complicated question. I also want you to know that Montana has 8 tribes, or excuse me, 8 reservations. And we have 12 tribes. So the difference between a reservation and a tribe is the reservation is the geographic boundary, including the tribes, and the tribe is the people. So as you can see, we've got Blackfeet, Crow, Confederated, Salish, and Kootenai tribes, Fort Belknap, woohoo, Fort Peck, Little Shell, Northern Cheyenne, and Rocky Boys. And then when you see in the other column, I've got the names of the tribes. So when you see Pakuni and in quotes is Blackfeet, the difference there is a lot of our tribes in Montana are asking people to acknowledge us by our ancestral names versus the European names that were sort of bestowed upon us after colonization. So for example, I am Aaniiih, but we've been historically known in Montana as Grovant. Crow is their Apsalica people. There's Salish, Kootenai, CSKT is really trying to move away from Flathead because there are 2 distinct tribes on that geographic boundary. So, if you forgive me, there's no way I'm going to try and pronounce Northern Cheyenne's ancestral name. I would not do them justice. So, so yeah, that's the definition between a reservation and a tribe. Very proud to say that Little Shell was recognized as a tribe last year after, I'd say, about 40 years of fighting for recognition. We're going to quickly go through land and sovereignty. We've been living successfully in North America for thousands of years, and reservations were a construct of the federal government to be used exclusively for tribes as their permanent homelands. There is a lot of history behind that that literally would take hours to dive into, but some of these reservations were created through treaties, others were created by statutes, executive orders, some were literally created through fights in tribal court just to be recognized, and that we're on the land that was granted to us literally in the late 1800s. I think what's important to note is the principle that land should be acquired from tribes only through treaties involve three assumptions: that both parties to treaties were sovereign powers. That means that Native nations is a sovereign power and the federal government is a sovereign power. The other thing is Indian tribes had some form of transferable title to the land. So through the judicial process going back 250 years, the federal government has recognized that Native Americans had some form of title to the land that they occupied before colonization. And the acquisition of Indian lands, solely a government matter. It was not left to individual colonists or states. Here's a map of what Montana did recognize as Indian land pre-colonization. And as you can see, it's a lot and it's complicated. And so through various federal policies, these lands were reduced to what you see now in orange: Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, Rocky Boys, Little Shell has a little bit of land. And so I hope that helps explain the reduction of land in Montana to where the reservation boundaries lie now. I also wanted to address tribal sovereignty. Under the American legal system, we have sovereign powers that are separate and independent from federal and state governments. It is true though, and it's really complicated, that the power that individual reservations and tribes has can vary. It's not the same for each one. So I think a good analogy is, you know, in Europe, for example, with Brexit, right? Britain can make decisions about Britain, and the same kind of holds true for, you know, CSKT, Flathead, formerly known as Flathead, Crow, Fort Belknap. We can make our own decisions about the extent and breadth of tribal sovereignty. However, that does require cooperation from the federal government, and those are issues that are still today being pounded out in the Supreme Court. I am going to play a little video, and so I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint. I'm going to go to YouTube, and these videos were produced through the Hoover Institution at policyed.org. This is a Montana High Tech Business Alliance presentation, and I think it's important to help underscore the economic realities in Indian nations. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to figure this out. Stop sharing. Here we go. Native Americans have been asking people to recognize our rights since before 1879, when Chief Joseph said, Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself. Early in the history of the United States, we lost sovereignty over our lives and jurisdiction over our land. The federal government forced us onto reservations, declared us wards of the state, and stripped us of our dignity. The federal government restricts individual and tribal rights to this day. This is the main reason why we are the poorest in the United States. But it was not always that way. Prior to European contact, Indigenous peoples had a long history of the dynamic economies and governance structures that we recognize today as the necessary ingredients for prosperity. Native Americans claimed their territories, made capital investments, and rewarded individual initiative. In the Southwest, agricultural peoples established clear ownership of floodplains, marking and enforcing land boundaries to reward stewardship. In the Southeast, families and clans owned cultivated gardens and orchards. Farther north, people marked trees to denote tribal boundaries, important pathways, and to claim forests for hunting, trapping, and timber. And along the Pacific, tribes used stones and bark trees to indicate ownership of spawning streams, fishing weirs, and clan gardens created by terracing beaches. Where societies considered land to be owned communally, individuals, families, and clans were generally entitled to the benefits of their work on that land. While Indigenous peoples were diverse, they all had well-established rules recognizing the ownership claims that allowed individuals, families, clans, and tribes to specialize in production and engage in trade. Long before colonization, robust trade networks connected tribes and the goods they produced. People from all over the continent gathered in places like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico to trade everything from salmon to turquoise to buffalo hides, copper, and obsidian. In these hubs, trade languages such as Chinook in the Northwest and Mobilian in the Southeast emerged to make it easier to exchange goods and share knowledge. Plains tribes improved their nutrition with Pacific salmon, and coastal tribes stayed warm with buffalo robes from the interior. Trade fostered prosperity, allowing many tribes to devote significant time and resources to leisure, art, and religious ceremonies. To support all of this economic activity, tribal governments evolved to fit regional conditions consistent with their customs and culture. This enabled Indigenous economies to adapt successfully to climate and technological changes. Indigenous traditions of treaty making and trade allowed Native Americans to adapt and prosper by trading with Europeans who brought beads, steel, horses, and other new commodities. Plains Indians, for example, became very successful horse societies. Native Americans didn't simply survive, they thrived. Eventually, however, as European settlement expanded, these dynamic, decentralized Indigenous institutions were forcibly replaced by centralized federal authority. This had dire consequences for Native Americans. Tribes were driven from their traditional territories and onto reservations where tribal practices like the Sundance and potlatch were banned. What was once a relatively free, prosperous, and open society of Indigenous economies was replaced with top-down, federal control that stripped us of our autonomy, dignity, and sources of wealth. In order for us to prosper again, we must regain the freedom and sovereignty to enjoy the same rights that other Americans take for granted. Thank you for watching that. So we're going to talk about just a second about citizenship and voting. American Indians were recognized as actual people by the Supreme Court in 1879. Chief Standing Bear of the Ponca people in Nebraska sued a general in the United States Army, and there was an argument made that habeas corpus didn't apply because we weren't humans. And so this was landmark legislation that happened. We were granted the right to vote in 1924, and we became citizens of the United States in 1924, and also citizens in the states in which we reside. We were recognized with the right to vote in 1948, but it wasn't until 1962 that we had the right to vote in every state. It was Utah was the last holdout. And so what I'd kind of like to underscore there is I have, my mom was born, when she was born, she did not have the right to vote. So that's a very important issue for us that we don't take for granted. Both tribes and individual Native Americans do pay taxes. That tends to be sometimes a common misunderstanding. I've got one more video, or another video for you in a series of 3. So let's see, we're gonna stop that. And, excuse me. For hundreds of years, the federal government has assumed a major and active role in managing all aspects of Native American life, a much larger and more intrusive role than it plays in non-Native economic life. Even before our ancestors were forced onto reservations, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the federal government functions as our guardian. We were reduced to the status of dependent wards. But the federal government failed to protect us and actually helped extract resources from our lands for the benefit of non-natives. Reservation boundaries were often drawn and redrawn to exclude us from valuable resources like arable land, gold, and oil. The Dawes Act of 1887 was billed as a way of integrating Native Americans into American society and assimilating us as independent yeoman farmers. Indians were allotted 160-acre parcels, but did not get title to the land, which was held in trust by the federal government because, according to the government, we were not competent and capable. In practice, this allotment era further eroded our individual rights and tribal sovereignty, removing millions of acres from tribal jurisdiction. Things actually became worse in 1934 when Congress eliminated the pathways to securing legal land title and locked our land into federal trust in perpetuity. Many rules and regulations affecting tribal lands are still dictated from Washington, D.C., where the Bureau of Indian Affairs oversees the management of 56 million acres of Indian country. Tribal governments and members remain legally obligated to defer to federal agencies on everything from land use decisions to managing a loved one's inheritance. Most tribal governments rely on grants allocated by D.C. politicians and tied to meeting federal priorities rather than community ones. Over the centuries, a constantly changing regime of federal policies overturned economies based on entrepreneurship and replaced them with economies dominated by government interests. Starting a business is now very slow and difficult because without federal approval, tribes and individual natives cannot use trust land as collateral to obtain loans. A flourishing Indigenous private sector has withered away. To revive Indigenous economies, we must reestablish tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction and restore the dynamic customs, culture, and dignity that existed before colonization. So you read that quote at the end of that video by Ernest Sickey, and I would like to talk to him about him in a few slides. But before that, we're going to move on to treaty money. In Montana, when I was growing up, there was this perception that we received free money, and that wasn't normally presented to us in a very positive way. So just to explain treaty money a little bit, we receive a distribution of funds based on leases on income on property that we have that's actually held in trust by the United States government. And how that works is, for example, I have about 500 acres of land on Fort Belknap. I maybe could build a house, but I couldn't drill I can't develop it. I literally can't do anything with it without the federal government's approval. If I did choose to, for example, lease it to a cattle farmer for grazing, that has to be all handled through the BIA. And what happens is the rancher pays the federal government, and then the federal government pays the individual that whose name is on the trust. So we do have a unique situation where we navigate at least one or two layers of federal bureaucracy in order to be able to profit from the land that we rightly hold. We also receive compensation for lands taken in connection with government projects. For example, if there were a hospital built or an airstrip. And some tribes receive benefits from the federal government to fulfill treaties, which were contractual obligations between the federal government and the individual Native nation. So the perception that it's free money is actually a myth, and it's untrue. There are definite stipulations on how we benefit from holding land in trust. And move on to the next slide. Federal Indian trust responsibility. This is a very complicated relationship. According to the federal government, it's a government to government relationship. And again, like I mentioned, this is sovereign nation dealing with a sovereign nation. According to the federal government, and this has been established through the judicial process, the United States has charged itself with a moral obligation of the highest responsibility and trust. And again, that was established in the courts. It's legally enforceable, and the federal government does have a fiduciary obligation to protect our treaty rights, our lands, our assets and resources, as well as a duty to carry out the mandates of federal law. And so by that I mean, we receive healthcare, the administration of our public schools, through a treaty agreement. So again, it's not, this is a construct of the federal government to protect our tribal lands, resources, and self-governance. And again, what makes that so complicated in Montana is there is this perception that we receive free everything. And what you're going to hear me say a lot is these are the results of, in my opinion, bad federal policy. That's debatable, but it is determined by federal policy. Speaking of American policy, we've been through many eras, colonization, termination. So getting back to termination, as you can see, it's twice in my little timeline of American policy. After colonization, there was a movement to kill the Indian, save the man. And then we went back to reorganization and that's really where the reduction of Indian land took place and Native Americans were forced onto reservations. And then you'll see the other termination. And back to Ernest Sickey. He is a prominent member of the Coushatta tribe in Louisiana. During this termination period, which occurred in the late 1950s, the federal government had a policy of literally saying, you don't exist anymore. The federal government will no longer recognize you as a tribe. And so Ernest Sickey fought in Vietnam, and when he returned, he fought for his people to be re-recognized, which is actually, to sort of bring that home, happened with Little Shell. It was, these people exist. They are still racially identified in their tribe, surviving, and all that we have asked the federal government is can you just please re-acknowledge that we exist? And that has been happening. Under the most recent executive administration, I would submit around 7 tribes all over the United States have been re-recognized, and they were terminated. Those tribes were terminated as a result of this federal government policy of termination. And, you know, most people have heard of the boarding school eras of Native American students, so I don't feel like it's necessary to go into that. Self-determination happened under actually Nixon's administration, where they decided both, as you can see in the quote, as a matter of justice and a matter of enlightened social policy, we must begin to act on the basis of what the Indians themselves have long been telling us. And that is, we want to be recognized. We would like to exercise our sovereignty. If you ask, I would say most Native people, they really like not to be, have to go through the layers of bureaucracy that are necessary under the current federal policy with Native American people. And I've got one last video. Oops, pause that. Forgive me. As Native Americans work to rebuild our nations and renew our economies, it is time to finally liberate tribes and tribal members from federal oversight. While the federal government must abolish its discriminatory laws, Indigenous communities must also strengthen their own tribal laws. Across the country, Indigenous communities are reforming their governments and reviving private sector economies. Tribes with diverse languages and cultures are reasserting jurisdiction over their land and people, reestablishing tribal sovereignty. Beyond escaping oversight from the federal government, successful tribes are actively restoring the rule of law to spur increased economic activity. That means clarifying tribal jurisdiction, upholding and enforcing contracts, and creating an attractive investment climate. Critical for encouraging economic activity, tribes like the Paskayaki are establishing independent judiciaries or relying on arbitration like the Navajo Nation peacemaking program to settle business disputes without political manipulation. In Nebraska, the Winnebago tribe built a casino to generate an influx of capital for their nation. This was the first step of a strategic plan for meaningful self-governance and economic prosperity. Instead of only distributing profits to tribal members, the Winnebago tribe established Ho-Chunk Incorporated, an independent economic development corporation that financed the infrastructure necessary to attract investors, businesses, and residents to the reservation and to create jobs. The Winnebago enacted and strengthened tribal laws and tax codes to free their economy from outdated federal laws and regulations. They reestablished trade with neighboring tribes. Within 1 decade, median household income increased over 60%, and reservation poverty was reduced to just 5%. By enacting tribal laws, explains legal scholar and Ho-Chunk CEO Lance Morgan, the tribe expands and flexes its sovereignty. It's really quite simple. Federal Indian law is restrictive, and tribal law is expansive. In Colorado, the Southern Ute tribe exercised their sovereignty to tap oil and gas resources without harming their natural environments. They used their oil and gas dollars to diversify their economies and provide monetary dividends, crucial infrastructure, social services, health insurance, and college education to tribal members. Across the country, diverse tribes are finding ways to benefit from modern market economies while protecting their unique customs and culture. But they have some things in common. Successful Indigenous economies have legal institutions that respect the rule of law and ensure the enforceability of contracts. Despite the persistence of colonial obstacles, many Native Americans are regaining control over their lives and their resources. This economic renaissance in Indigenous communities is about more than prosperity. It's about dignity. As Bill Yellowtail, member of the Apsallaka Crow, explains,
Indian sovereignty means re-equipping Indian people with the dignity of self-sufficiency the right not to depend upon the white man, the government, or even the tribe. This is not a new notion. It is only circling back to the ancient and most crucial of Indian values, and understanding that the power of the tribal community is founded upon the collective energy of strong, self-sufficient, self-initiating, entrepreneurial, independent, healthful, and therefore powerful individual persons, human beings, Indians.
Thank you for watching that. We're going to bring this back to Montana a little bit. It's really good news that there are tribes all over the United States that are taking unconventional methods to have access to a free market system that non-natives enjoy. And one of the things, and that's happening in Montana as well. One of the biggest barriers here in Montana is our native nations are so rural. And so what you saw at Ho-Chunk, Southern Ute, they have a great advantage, and that is that they're a little bit more urban. So workforce is not typically an issue. And here, as you can see, I wanted to make this relevant for the CEOs and business people here in Montana. When Native Americans have same professional experience as non-natives, their odds of being employed are still 31% lower than whites. And the other thing about the employment statistics is the lowest white employment rate, which is Alabama's 73.9%, is still higher than the Native Americans' highest rate of employment. And in Montana, there is consistently, and I've looked at statistics going back 50 years, there is consistently a 20% disparity in employment rates of whites versus Native Americans. So for example, currently with COVID, numbers are all over the place, but pre-COVID, the employment rate in Montana for whites was around between 70 and 80%, and it was still between 50 and 60% for Native Americans. Another reason why workforce is a challenge is 17% of Native American high school students graduate, or graduates attend college, and those who attend college typically have around a 37% graduation rate. I am going to plug Rocky here for a minute. I am proud to say that this fall we are going to have a record number of Native American students starting their freshman year. And where tech is involved, connectivity and access to technology is still a big issue. For example, there are many areas on Fort Belknap, Northern Cheyenne, Crow, definitely Fort Peck, where they simply don't have access to internet, and therefore also the technology to be able to train in STEM and tech. So I'm wrapping things up. I know this has been at a breakneck pace, but again, we want to make sure there's room for questions. This might be a little uncomfortable for some people, but I just wanted to bring up some frequently asked questions. Is Washington Redskins really offensive? You know, that really depends on who you ask. If you would like, I'll weigh in with my personal opinion. Yes and no. Does it offend me personally? No, it does not. And in my opinion, pouring the resources to get a name changed could be better used to confront some of the social issues that we face on our reservations: drug use, alcoholism, broken families, the lack of quality education. That's my position. However, I have brilliant, amazing, educated Native American friends who this is an issue that's extremely important to them. So again, it really depends on the individual that you're engaging with. This is a question that comes up a lot in Billings, where I live. What's the deal with the folks downtown? We have a large homeless population and they're extremely visible downtown. And I hope that this presentation has helped some of you, all of you, understand the extremely complicated social issues behind the people who are steeped in unhealthy ways of surviving. So, you know, alcohol is an issue. I'll just confront that. But again, you know, we're looking at a population of people who have been subjected to federal policy that does not encourage our ability to participate in a free market system, get a quality education, go to college. I'm a first-generation college graduate. And so, you know, it is true that there tends to be visible homeless population with mental health and substance abuse issues. However, I just ask that when people are seeing that they have an open mind. And, you know, one of the things that Christina knows we talk about all the time is, and again, this is my personal opinion, this isn't about blame or looking back and going, well, this is why I am now. And I feel that we should all acknowledge the past, and we need our non-Native allies to walk alongside us as we gain the economic freedom and the freedoms that non-Natives enjoy, and being good neighbors. Once we can do that, I think we'll start seeing real change versus this mindset of us and them. We are we share Montana, we all love this state. And so another question that I've been asked my entire life, why can't Native Americans just pick themselves up by the bootstraps? Well, again, like you saw in my presentation, we can pick ourselves up by the bootstraps. We absolutely can. However, our boots are weighed down by bad federal policy, bureaucracy, poor healthcare, all the obligations that the federal government, through contractual obligations, promised us, has resulted in substandard situations that a lot of non-Natives don't necessarily understand. And and someone asked a question. Some tribes seem to be more successful than others in regard to economic development. Are tribes willing to share their success examples with other tribes? For example, SK Technology. Not really. And that's something that I am extremely passionate about and try to work with various tribes. So, for example, if I'm at if I'm in Browning at Blackfeet and they say, we want to start a bottled water plant, but we have some issues with transportation and railroad, and I'll suggest, well, why don't you pick up the phone and call SKC and find out what they did to make some of their industries so successful. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. I encourage you to remember that each Native nation all over the United States, but especially Montana, we are our own Native nation. So, you know, that would be the same thing as expecting Germany to call Spain, and that's really up to them. I would love to see more cooperation and collaboration between Native nations in Montana. It's undeniable that Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have experienced incredible success. I will underscore that, however, with what a lot of people don't see is their people still suffer from the same social issues that every other tribe in Montana experiences. And I hope you find that helpful. And when we do open it up for questions, I encourage you to ask me anything. I don't feel like if we try and stay politically correct, then questions won't get answered. And I'm absolutely willing to have uncomfortable conversations. And in my opinion, you don't know what you don't know. And I'm so happy to help provide more understanding. I've got some suggested reading here, and like Christina said, this will be recorded in perpetuity, which I'm really excited about. And I am so happy to provide other readings. So Mean Spirit by Linda Hogan depicts Oklahoma natives in the 1920s during the oil boom. In my opinion, I feel like everyone should read that. Counting Coup is a book based on Crow Reservation. I don't want to spoil it for you. It's very, very good. I Am a Man by Joe Starita is a biography of Chief Standing Bear, who, like I mentioned, his was the landmark case that helped Native Americans be identified as actual human beings, and it is a fascinating read. A Poverty of Nations, I feel, is such an important read because it talks about the economic barriers that third world countries all over the world face. They also use Native American tribes in Montana as examples of that, and they present solutions. And I think that it's really important. It really helped me change my mindset when I looked at my people and Native people and our barriers to economic freedom. Dr. Terry Anderson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution who has dedicated almost his entire academic life to researching Native economic issues. And so if you give him a quick Google, his papers come up and they're so good. Finally, a big thank you to the Montana High Tech Business Alliance, policyed.org, Hoover Institution. Some of the content that I provided today came from the Montana Office of Public Instruction. And I also want to thank the Alliance for Renewing Indigenous Economies. Through them and policyed.org, we were able to produce those videos that I think are really important and great illustrations of where we're at and where we're going. And let's see. Whew, I'm just under the gun, Christina.
Awesome job, Misty.
Thank you.
Well, so now we're going to open it up for questions. So if folks who have been listening in have a question, you're welcome to unmute your mic and speak and share your question, or you can also type your questions in the chat. We did have another question submitted in advance, which maybe we can start out with. The question was regarding climate. How is climate change impacting your community, and what solutions are you considering to mitigate it? Have you heard of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act?
Yes, I have heard of that act, and thank you for your question. From my perspective, climate change in Montana it's a big issue, but it's sort of not in the top 5 of the issues that we really care about. It's scooting up the scale simply because of the pipeline. Some tribes are for it, some aren't. And I'm sure that you've all heard, Blackfeet, the Glacier National Park is extremely important economically to the Blackfeet people. And it's undeniable that the glaciers there are shrinking. And so, Blackfeet are very concerned about the amount of tourists that come through the park and, the diminishing of that. It's actually, that's a tough one because some tribes really depend economically on tourism, but also understanding that climate change is affecting the way tourists are coming. And so it's a balance. But overall, I would say outside of Keystone Pipeline development, climate change isn't a huge issue in Indian country in Montana for now.
Okay, we'll allow a minute for other questions that people might have.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Michelle Holiday.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Misty. Hi, Christina. I'm not in Montana, but I do work with Montana tribes in energy and infrastructure. And I wanted to just commend you for having this webinar. And I think that Misty and I have my own consulting company. I'm a member of the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma, but I've worked with a couple of the tribes in the state of Montana. And one of the members of the Montana High Tech Alliance, Misty and I worked to encourage them to be a member. And I think some of you have met Alvin Windy Boy with iResponse, which is a technology company, but it's really focused on cultural reviews and cultural management. And so I think that being a trailblazer like Misty and Montana and Alvin, I think the individuals that are at least on this webinar or who will listen, is the next step is you understand, but you're building these partnerships, business relationships, and how you do that is to understand the context. But I think Misty can agree that how do you build a business relationship and a partnership with alliances with respect to technology? And I think that the beginning of this starts to begin that discussion, a broader perhaps discussion with the membership, because ultimately infrastructure is needed for broadband, but some of the services that the association, the members provide can certainly be helpful on the reservations. And sort of that next discussion, I think, is really one that fits in the economic development. And of course, I've heard about the S&K technology, but there are these emerging opportunities, niches that are beginning to develop. So I think Montana really has it smart in terms of other states that have tribes, and the willingness for you to sort of take that to the next level is really exciting, and I encourage you. And I don't know if Misty has a comment to that, but I think that the individuals who are on this, I'm sure there's probably more discussions about that, because I think as business people and understanding the cultural perspectives and the history really do help you leverage and position yourself to have some meaningful relationships and building those bridges of commonality than differences. So I just wanted to make that comment, and thank you for the session today.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, actually, I do have a couple of comments about that. So Michelle referred to Alvin Windy Boy's company, and what is amazing about that is Alvin, it's on Rocky Boy's reservation. Alvin built it with no tribal dollars. And so what I love about that is it's a Native-owned business, and he's proud of it as well. And he will tell anyone, he built it on Rocky Boys with no federal dollars, no help from the tribe. And it was really a bootstrapped situation that he just found a problem in private sector and came up with a solution. What they do is they have automated and streamlined the process of, and Michelle, you can weigh in on this if I get it wrong, they have automated and streamlined the process of cultural preservation sites. If a company like Verizon or Northwestern wanted to build, the government requires it designated as not being a cultural preservation site. And prior to what Alvin built, the process to do that required a stack of paper, literally. I mean, he's got photos, it's this high. And so now it's a seamless process. And he has employees all over the United States, like Michelle, and has actually brought people from outside the reservation to move to Montana, Box Elder, so that they can work for iResponse. And it's just an amazing success story. The other company that's coming to mind, not in Montana, but it's such a great idea. In New Mexico, there's an organization called Cultivating Coders. And it's a nonprofit, but what they do is they go into Native communities mobily and they teach a coding school. And it's typically about 5 weeks. Each participant gets a laptop and instruction from expert coders. And by the time they're done, they are proficient in a couple of different languages. And one of the things that they're finding, especially when they go into communities where English is not their first language, they are adapting rapidly to being able to learn coding language. And it's been incredibly successful. Last year, they received a grant from Microsoft for, I want to say, about $1.5 million. And so we do have like just these amazing success stories. It's really cool. And thank you so much, Michelle, for mentioning that. Okay, so we have a question. If the current federal policies towards sovereignty are restricting economic development, how can the laws be changed? Second, your comment on tribes not necessarily sharing business success stories, does that also apply to cooperating to change federal law? Thank you so much. Those are really important questions. The laws can be changed through the legislative process, which in my opinion, Native Americans should be encouraged to participate in more than we do. I don't think that we recognize what a voice we do have. We send delegations to Congress constantly. However, those are really short trips and sometimes don't seem to gain much ground. So my short answer to that is the laws can be changed. And this is to your second question as well. If we did unite more and come together and collaborate and reach out to our federal delegations to ask for, you know, restrictions on what the BIA can do on our behalf. There are forms that still exist. If you want to do something through the BIA, you have to be declared competent first. And that would take a small federal policy change. So thank you for your question. I hope I answered it. And I want to add, we're getting there. We really are.
Misty, I have a question.
Sure.
You know, you'd mentioned earlier that climate might not be in your top 5 issues of things that are really on the top of the list that either could, like, what do you think are the top things that would either remove barriers that exist for sovereignty and entrepreneurship to thrive on reservations and for Native people to thrive on reservations? What are the top maybe 3 to 5 issues that you think we should really be focusing on and paying attention to make the biggest difference?
So you asked what I think, so I'm going to tell you what I think. A lot of tribes in Montana are still operating off of constitutions that were adopted 60 to 100 years ago. So I think one of the first efforts that would open the gates to economic freedom would be to change our constitutions, our legislative processes, so that we fulfill, like you saw in the last video, so that many tribes have already done this, where it's constitutional that they fulfill their contractual obligations, that we, hopefully the federal government would cooperate with us so that we could present more opportunities for outside business to come in and develop. So I would say that's number one, legislative change within the government of the tribe. I would say number 2 is education. Educated people are more healthy. They make better choices. They have better opportunities. That's just a reality in the United States. And our public school systems on reservations, which is administered by the BIA's Department of Education, is substandard. I mean, it truly is. And so if we could if we could improve education for our students, those generations could come up and start asking these questions. Why is our government a mess? Why are we operating off of a constitution that was drafted 60 years ago? I think education is a huge deal. And then I would say number 3, health, addressing rampant diabetes, alcoholism, substance abuse, just poor health in general, heart disease. I mean, we are number 1 in pretty much every of those categories for fatalities in Indian country. Our Native American male life expectancy is 20 years less than for non-natives. And so obviously, because if we brought in industry that needs 300 workers, does a Native nation have 300 healthy people to have those jobs? And I submit not every reservation in Montana has a healthy workforce. So I would say health, and I think number 5 would be to address broken families. I work often with young Native people that have raised themselves, have overcome extreme obstacles to get to college. They're first generation graduates. They're in their particular culture, and I'm painting a broad brush. This isn't true for every Native nation. In a lot of Native American cultures, leaving the reservation to get an education is not supported. So I think, helping to support that, I think would be really important as well. Misty, will you provide an email address to contact? Yes, actually, so I'm going to enter my cell phone number and my email address on the chat. Please share it, or please save it. And you are welcome, more than welcome, to call me, reach out, email me anytime with any question. So let me just pull that back into that. I'm talking to myself and my speaker's on, isn't it? There we go.
Maybe one final question I would have in these last 3 minutes of our time together. So currently, nationally, there's a lot of conversation around Black Lives Matter and equity and justice. We're having these conversations in Montana and in our high-tech community. Do you have any final thoughts for us on how we can support, or how these issues of equity and justice, you see them applying to our tribal communities?
Well, you know this, Christina, my main ask of non-Native people in Montana is to please have an open mind and be willing to take a look at the social history behind where we are now. My presentation isn't to change anybody's mind. It's not to lecture anyone on how you should treat people. It's really to give a perspective of what we've been through. And I barely scratched the surface. I think that really is the most important thing. And then the other thing is, when my Native professional people, colleagues are asked, what can we do to help the Native American situation? The answer is always hire us, give us jobs, be willing to reach out to a Native community. I am often surprised at how many urban populations have never traveled the 20 or 10 miles to a reservation to go to a powwow, or anybody can sit in on a council meeting. Yeah, it would be maybe weird, a little uncomfortable, but that would start blowing people's minds. And so that's just be willing to have an open mind and be a good neighbor.
Hey, Misty, this is Susie. I'm with Foundant Technologies here in Bozeman. Would you have resources on where we can post jobs or recruit for to to broaden that pool so that we could hire?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So you've got my contact information. Please email me and I will help. If you've got a job posting, I will help get it to where it needs to go, or even find a person that can do what you're posting.
Great, excellent. I will put a recruiter in touch with you and have you connect, and that would be awesome.
Awesome. Well, we're to the end of our time. Misty, thank you so much for educating us and sharing this today. And I want to remind everyone who's participating that a recording and a transcript of today's presentation and related materials, including some of the resources Misty has shared, and her contact information will be made available. We'll email them out to everyone who registered, and we'll also have them posted on our website. So if you want to share all of these resources in this video with your friends and colleagues, you'll be able to do that. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your time today. I really appreciate it. And please don't hesitate to reach out. That is an invitation. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Misty.